Welcome back to the Great and Spacious Building. Last week we met Bishop John Hyrum Koyle, the humble farmer from Salem, Utah, who was granted a visionary commission in 1894 to dig a tunnel into a mountain near Spanish Fork and secure a massive, divinely protected treasure. This treasure, he was told, would serve as the ultimate relief fund for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints during a coming global economic and spiritual collapse. Today, we move on from the vision to the physical reality, the decades of backbreaking work that created the relief mine. This story is not just about a hole in the ground, it's about the power of belief to mobilize human capital, the complex mechanics of folk prophecy, and the formation of a distinct, dedicated counterculture right in the heart of Zion. We're going to explore the unique financial structure of the mining company, the physical progress of the tunnel, and the powerful sociological forces that drew thousands of followers to the banner of this small town prophet. The relief mine was, at its core, a perpetual, non-profit construction project. Bishop Koyle incorporated the Koyle Mining Company in 1909 to manage the work. The financial model Koyle set up was critical to the movement's success and its longevity because it protected him from the charge of merely trying to get rich. As Ogden Kraut, our biographer of Koyle, states, the relief mine, the funds were raised by selling non-assessable shares in the company. It was understood from the beginning that the money raised from the sale of shares was not an investment for immediate profit. It was to be used solely to pay for the materials, the equipment, and wages of the men working on the mine. The shares were symbolic, a form of donation or tithing toward a future collective good. The actual treasure, Koyle constantly reminded his followers, belonged to the Lord and would be used for the poor and the church. The miners and the shareholders were sacrificing today for the deliverance of Zion tomorrow. This model serves as a brilliant apologetic shield against accusations of fraud. Since Koyle was not promising an immediate financial return to shareholders, but rather a spiritual and temporal relief for the community at large, he could not easily be categorized as a common swindler. He was an executive of a God-ordained public works project. The initial work was incredibly difficult. It's mining. Mostly manual labor performed by volunteers in small crews with picks and shovels. Koyle constantly worked on the mine himself. The sheer physical effort required to dig a tunnel of this magnitude into solid rock is hard to overstate. Kraut quotes Koyle on his philosophy regarding the work. I quote, "Bishop Koyle told his men many times that the work was not going to be easy. He said, 'The Lord wants to know who is willing to put their shoulder to the wheel and do the work, even when the returns seem far off.' He saw the labor as a test of faith and endurance." End quote. As the decades went on, the tools improved. By the 1920s and 1930s, the company was using air drills, compressors, and rail cars to remove the spoil. But the progress was still slow. The main tunnel, the relief tunnel as it was called, was projected to go thousands of feet into the mountain. The physical reality of the mine became the bedrock of faith in this community. The miners and shareholders, known as Koylites, formed a tight-knit society. They shared a common sacrifice, a common vision, and a deep-seated belief that they were the most prepared people on earth for the coming troubles. Koyle's prophetic claims were not abstract. They were tied directly to the geological events within the mountain. To his followers, every strange rock formation, every sudden change in the tunnel's composition was a prophetic sign that validated the project. This is a key element of folk religion or folk magic. The natural world is infused with meaning, and the prophet or prophets act as the interpreter of those signs. Koyle was constantly guiding the work based on what he saw in the rock, confirming his vision for his followers. According to the official history, Koyle predicted several specific phenomena long before they were ever encountered. The first one here is known as the Black Rock. Koyle prophesied that the tunnel would pass through a section of black rock, a formation he called the Coal of the Ages, which symbolized the darkness of the world just before the light of the second coming. When the miners hit a section of black, carbonaceous shale, it was considered a stunning fulfillment of prophecy. A second prophecy from Koyle, known as the Three Caves, came into play at this time as well. Koyle prophesied that the miners would encounter 3 caves, each containing vital symbolic objects. Ogden Kraut notes the discovery of the first cave. I quote, Koyle told the miners exactly where the first cave would be. You will strike a small cavern just big enough to stand in. And inside you will find a small pool of water and a petrified bird on a pedestal. When they broke through, they found the cavern and the bird exactly as Koyle described it, unquote. The discovery of the petrified bird was perhaps the most famous and compelling of the signs, becoming a powerful internal piece of evidence for the miners or Koylites. The bird, often interpreted as the dove of peace, was taken as a sign that their mission was indeed blessed by a higher being. Our third prophecy here is the tunnel collapse. The most significant and terrifying prophecy was that the main tunnel would collapse before the final strike, symbolizing the collapse of the world's economic system. This was not a warning, it was a planned event. The collapse, when it inevitably happened, as often occurs in decades-old hard rock tunnels, was not a disaster, but the ultimate validation of Koyle's foresight. From an empirical historian's perspective, these signs are profound instances of prophetic manufacturing, or more kindly, prophetic confirmation bias. In any tunneling project of that scale, you will encounter different geological formations, faults, or water pockets, caves and voids. They're not uncommon. Again, this isn't the first mountain to be dug into in Utah. Therefore, there is a background of what some of these formations would look like. Tunnel collapses are also just a risk of the job. But Koyle provided the narrative key that transformed random geological events into evidence of divine orchestration. The facts didn't change, but their meanings did. This is precisely how successful prophetic movements maintain momentum in the face of long delays. Every obstacle is reframed as a necessary step in some sort of divine plan. This stands in stark contrast to how mainstream apologetics often work today, which attempt to retrofit historical events to match doctrine. Koyle's method was much more potent. He proactively infused the physical work with prophetic meaning, ensuring that the labor itself was an act of faith. The biggest catalyst for the growth of the Koyle movement was none other than America's Great Depression. This was a global economic cataclysm in the 1930s, but it's also the realization of Koyle's dire prophecies, validating his entire life's work in the eyes of his followers and attracting thousands of new adherents to the relief mine at this point. Koyle had been predicting the collapse of the monetary system since 1894. When banks failed, paper money lost value and Utah suffered severe economic distress. Koyle's isolated anti-establishment message suddenly seemed prescient, even inspired. This era saw a major influx of new Koylites or new miners joining the project. These people were not just marginal members of society, they were often devout Latter-day Saints, including successful farmers, businessmen, and even local church leaders who were disillusioned by the church's apparent inability to offer concrete temporal solutions to the crisis. The sociologist in us must note that Koyle offered something crucial that the institutional church, focused on spiritual survival, could not. They offered an active physical refuge. By investing in the mine, they were not just praying for the future, they were actively digging their way out of economic doom. This was tangible hope, something the church could not offer. Ogden Kraut emphasizes this strong community spirit that was built around the mine. I quote from his work, "The Koylites truly believed they were laboring for the salvation of Zion. They were known for their willingness to share resources, help each other, and live a life centered on the mine and the prophecies. They established a powerful social bond, a subculture of preparedness and prophecy," end quote. This tight-knit community, defined by its belief in Koyle's separate revelation, began to pose a problem for the church hierarchy in Salt Lake City. Koylites were essentially functioning as a church within the church. They sustained the local bishop and the first presidency, but they followed the temporal direction of Bishop Koyle. This tension is exactly what happens when charismatic authority, the prophet who speaks directly to God, clashes with bureaucratic authority, the institution that runs the LDS Church. The final element of Koyle's long-term plan was the location of the ore itself. Koyle insisted the treasure would not be found until all the signs were fulfilled and the world had reached its end. He had a specific final direction for the miners. They were to tunnel thousands of feet and then turn sharply upward, so down and then up. The treasure, he claimed, was suspended in a massive ancient vault, not resting on the bedrock. This final dramatic turn became the focus of all of their future efforts. So the story of the relief mine is a powerful illustration of the deep roots of folk religion, folk magic, and charismatic prophecy or charismatic authority in Mormonism. John Hyrum Koyle was a 20th century Joseph Smith, using the vocabulary of treasure, revelation, temporal salvation to mobilize a dedicated and faithful following. The sheer volume of the work, the miles of tunnel dug, the heavy equipment utilized, the lives dedicated to the project testifies to the unwavering conviction of these Koylites, much like the early converts to the LDS Church. As we move into our next episode, the drama shifts from the mountains to the main street of Salt Lake City. The growth of the Koyle movement, fueled by the Great Depression and validated by the prophetic signs within the rock, became too significant for the institutional church to ignore. The question was no longer about the mine's validity, but about John Hyrum Koyle's authority. When an ordained bishop starts issuing prophecies that draw away the loyalty, funds, and labor of thousands of Latter-day Saints, the highest levels of church governance must act. Next week, we examine the church's reaction, the inquiries, the warnings, and the eventual painful ecclesiastical trial that would pit Koyle's personal revelation directly against the centralized authority of the first presidency. If you're finding this material compelling, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you can get notified of our upcoming videos. Your engagements, your likes, your comments, your subscriptions help bring this complex historical narrative to light. I also encourage you to look into some of the primary accounts from Koyle miners themselves, many of which are collected in one of the books we're using, The Koyle Relief Mine by Ogden Kraut, but also if you check into the church's archival website, the LDS Church's archival website, if you look up James Talmage and his papers, James Talmage, he's going to be a focal point of our next episode, but we can find accounts from actual miners in the Talmage papers, which are utilized throughout this series as well. Next week, we're going to have our episode part 3 of the relief mine, and it's going to be entitled The Church Weighs the Treasure. Until then, thanks for joining me today. Remember that the most interesting parts of history, whether it be LDS or not, are often found in the tunnels dug by the devoted. See y'all next week.